Hey there again, Ian here, and this is part 2 of my how to make an advanced intro in Cinema 4D and After Effects. So by now, hopefully you've managed to render out your intro. If you're following along, you should have something a bit like this. So it's not perfect by any means. I think it zooms out a bit too far, but for something to work on, it's looking pretty good. I'm really liking the textures and the lighting looks pretty cool. So as long as you set up the render settings here and made a file name, you should, in theory, actually already have all the files in a folder, but if not, you can always just go to File, Save As, make sure this is an animation, and TIFF PSD layers, and just hit OK, and as you can see I have them all here, and just save it there. And if you don't have the After Effects file, you can just save the project file here as well. So now that that's all done, we can close this and we can jump into After Effects. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is open this file, and so we'll just go and find our file. I save mine to my desktop, and you'll notice that you have an AEC file. If After Effects can't open this, then you need to install the Cinema 4D for After Effects plugin. I'm sure you can Google that to find out how. I also have a tutorial on it somewhere on my channel, which I'll put in the description. So we're just going to drag this into After Effects, and you'll see we have a folder here, one with a composition and one with our render. So let's just double click on the composition, and you'll see we have basically a mess of lights here, and in the background we have our render. So what we want to do really is highlight all of our lights here, which have the light.2, everything down to the sunlight, and what we want to do is just click the little eye to turn it off, and we also want to press this little button here, which will hide it. The little man peeking over the fence if you drop him down, and then press this button here. It's called the shy feature. What it's going to do is just hide it from our composition here, just so we don't have to really deal with it, because really we don't need to have them here. We just need it for the effect we need to actually happen. So the next thing we want to do is just delete these other two lights, which are they are the lights here, our spotlights. So we can delete them as we're not going to use them for anything. And next we want to right click, click New, Solid, and we're just going to call these stars. And then we want to go into our effects and find optical flares. This is a plugin by Video Copilot. Most people have this plugin. If not, then you can buy it or you can look up a way to get it. So we just want to drag this onto our star layer, and you can see we have a little flare which we can move around. So we want to change this track mode to add, and this will place it over the scene. Similarly, if you keep it normal, you can change your render mode from on black to on transparent, and that will put it over as well. So what we want to do is actually put one of these flares on every single one of those lights we made. So we're just going to change the source type to track lights, make these names start with light, and select lights all. Now it won't do anything, and that's because in our scene we actually made the intensity 0. So we're just going to use light intensity and turn that off, as well as use scale. And straight away we get this completely blown out scene, and we can actually change the brightness down to say 10, and you can see we have all these dots here. So next let's jump into our optical flares, and we're just going to turn off these streaks here. These are all of these things coming out. So we just want to turn that off, and that, that, just so we have the glint, which in fact we want to turn the spike ball off as well, just so it's not too big. Click OK, and it all seems to disappear, but that's just because it's too small. So if we just put it back up to 50, or something like that, then we have this lovely scene, which, moving through the camera, all the stars move with the camera as well. So that's a pretty cool way to get these kind of a depth almost of stars. And of course you can change these values if you want them brighter. And a good thing to do is just click randomize lights, just so it makes them a little bit more random. And I'm also going to go into flicker and just play with these values. So there we go, there we have our stars. That's how I created them, and it looks pretty cool, it looks a bit realistic. If I was to turn this layer off, you can see the difference it makes. So it's pretty noticeable, it's a nice effect. So the next thing we want to do is actually involve this sunlight as well. So to do that, all I'm going to do is rename this to A Sun. And what that's going to do is when we create our optical flare, we can make it so it tracks lights beginning with the letter A, just so it doesn't track every single one of these lights as well. So we're going to go to right click, New, Solid, and Sun. And again, we're just going to drag on optical flares and change the render mode to on transparent. Change the source type to track lights, and change the name that starts with A. So again, we're just going to turn off the use light intensity and scale. Then we're just going to go into options, preset, motion graphics, and golden sun. That's going to create this really nice realistic sun. Now you can't really see it much, so if we turn our scale up to maybe 200, maybe even further to 500, we get this really nice looking sun in the distance. And of course you can change this if you want it a bit brighter. We can have this sun here. So I'm going to have the brightness on 200, maybe the scale on 300. So we just get this really nice looking natural sun. Now for the meantime, I'm just going to turn off both of these flares, just so we can move around a bit easier. And we're going to look a bit more at colour correction. So I'm just going to go to New, Adjustment Layer, and in here we'll put all of our colour correction. So the first thing we want is perhaps a curves, and just drag that in here. And we're just going to make the black slightly off black, and we're just going to add a tiny bit of contrast. So making this kind of S shape here. And that's just going to create this really nice contrast. Maybe it's a bit too much, so just drag it down. So it's a really faint S shape. This end point is what changes the black value, and the top one is what changes the white value. So if you want your whites a bit grayer, then you can change that, but for now we want white as white and black as just off black. The next thing we're going to do is actually incorporate Magic Bullet Looks. This is another plugin, and we're just going to drag this in here. This is another plugin a lot of people have, and another plugin which there is a lot of ways to get. And we're just going to turn on the stars for now, just so we can see what we're working with. So we're just going to go in here, and you can see this is our image, and we have hundreds of presets here. So we could play around with some of these to see if you like any of them. A few of them would go a bit over the top, kind of ruin the scene. So I'm just going to add perhaps a sharpen filter, and then in here I'm just going to add a tiny bit of shutter streak, but I'm going to turn the boost down a bit. That's just going to give, if I turn it up, it's going to give these little streaks here, and it just creates a bit of an atmosphere, which is quite nice. It's very subtle as long as you keep it down. And we're also going to put in a vignette. Just drag this, or change the aspect ratio here to 1.6, which is what we're working with. And we can change the intensity to something like 75. Just click done. And we have this quite subtle color correction. Now, as we're working in space, we kind of want this to have like a coolish feel to it, kind of a blue. So in the curves as well, we're just going to add a tiny bit of blue to the blacks as well, and just drag this up just a tiny bit. And that's just going to tint a tiny bit of blue in the scene. Maybe a bit too much still. There we go, just so it's a very subtle effect. Ooh. Zoom in here. So you can see very, very subtle. And one other thing I'm going to add, if I turn the stars off again, so we can move around a bit quicker, I'm going to add a letterbox. I have a plugin for this called Letterboxer, but you could simply do this by, I'll show you a tip in a second. The plugin itself is called Letterboxer by Magic Bullet as well, and it's going to have a letterbox of 2.1 ratio, which looks something like this. But another way you could do this is just by creating a solid, a black solid, and then using a mask. If you double click, it will take up the whole scene, and then you can just grab these points here, drag them down a tiny bit to where you want, and then drag these points up, and then just click subtract, and you'd be left with a very similar effect. But luckily I have a plugin for this. And then to create a kind of more cinematic look, I'm actually going to use grain. I'm just going to use a built-in grain tool and drag it above the letterboxer. I'm going to change the intensity to about 0.3, the color mode to monochromatic, and then if we change the viewing to final, we can have a look at what it'll look like. We might need to change the depth channel to something else. So it gives this really subtle kind of film-esque look to it. We'll need to change this to 16. And if I turn it off, there's a very subtle difference, maybe even 0.5. And with our stars on again, we have this look here, which is really nice. So this is more or less the color correction I use. It's slow when screen recording. It kind of just creates this nice look. What we started with was this, and we've just Not changed too much, just made it look a little bit better than the original render. Just gives it a little bit extra. One final touch you might want to add is actually a bit of motion blur. A lot of people won't have this plugin, but I have it. It's called Real Smart Motion Blur. It's made by the same people that made Twixtor, which I know is incredibly overused. But this is a great way for motion designers to add kind of a bit of motion blur in post. I'm pretty sure, in fact, you can use a plugin called Time Warp. I think this has it built in. And if I just change this to 100%, ooh, did not like that. I'll in fact, if I turn off all these layers, I'm just going to add Time Warp to our actual composition. There we go. Change the speed to 50. No, sorry, to 100. And if we enable motion blur and change the shutter control to manual and change this to something like 300, this gives a really subtle motion blur effect to especially our asteroids. But the plugin that I use is called Real Smart Motion Blur, and I'm just going to drag this onto our scene here, and if I change the blur amount to something like 0.7, it'll do more or less the same thing, but it'll just be a tiny bit more accurate. So as you can see, especially with the asteroids, they're slightly blurred, and if I was to turn it off, they're in focus. So it's a subtle effect, but in a lot of scenes it makes all the difference. This one doesn't benefit from it too much, but in a lot of scenes it does make a huge difference. So I've potentially put the grain a bit too much. I'm going to change the size to 0.5 and maybe the intensity to 0.3. That's a bit better. And if we just put all of our lights back on, we have our final result for our intro. So the next steps you can do is add sound. I'm not going to do a tutorial on that stage just because my techniques for sound are terrible. I kind of use the same few sounds over and over, and there's no point teaching a bad technique, because if it rubs off on anyone, then that's another person with bad sound. So you can add whatever you like. Try and avoid using the standard kind of Transformers sound effects for everything, and all the kind of stock sound effects you got from Video Copilot, because a lot of them are overused. You've got to really make it subtle, but I'm not very good at it at all, so I don't really want to teach you that, just because I don't know it especially well. So this is pretty much the series wrapped up. I hope you've learned something from this post-production. You may have learned my techniques for it. But yeah, it's a pretty cool final result. I'm pretty sure you'll agree. And it's slightly more advanced than my old series, which is good. And yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed watching this. It's been a bit of fun doing it, and I'll probably do a few more like this in the future, kind of big, longer tutorials. If you do have any kind of requests, feel free to send them to me, and if they're good, I'll use them and kind of name you in the description, blah blah blah. Yeah, so enjoy making intros now that you know a slightly more advanced way to do it. So yeah.